Okay, so this is a new thing. I'm very excited to have as my first guest, Jamison Green. For those of you who are going to be new to this series, this is going to be the first in all of them, and I'm currently thinking about calling it "The Shoulders of Giants." I had originally was thinking about using elder, but then I realized that's a complicated word used very differently in very cultures. So I wanted to use something that sort of gives people the idea. So a lot of the people I want to interview and that Rachel will be photographing are people who were already doing the work in Transland when we showed up, when we were the babies, even though that's hard to believe. Believe me, my students would be shocked to hear that I was ever, a baby in any scene. And the reality is we were 30. We weren't babies either. So I know at least one person who is actually younger than me who will be someone I'm interviewing because she was already doing the work when we started. So that's Daniela Skinny, who I'm sure you know too. But yeah, so the idea is that it was really very much motivated by the fact that my friend Lynn Conway died last week or a week and a half ago. And I just thought there's so many other older people who were amazing resources for me, mentors to me, to Rachel, who even if we didn't have a personal connection, brought so much to trans movement and trans life, whether it was by being famous or by writing books or by running organizations. And so it's really kind of apropos that I asked James first because we had books come out the same year, even though he had been doing the work much, much, much before that. So the book in some ways was a culmination, right? So can you talk a little bit about first, I guess, Becoming a Visible Man?
Becoming a Visible Man, my first nonfiction book. Um, it was, I actually started trying to pitch a book in 1995 and couldn't get anywhere. Had an amazing conversation with one of the big editors at St. Martin's Press who read my proposal and my sample chapter and was blown away that he called me at my work. I was working as a tech writer at Visa, the credit card company. That's what they hate being called that, but because their software is what they are, their financial processing. So anyway, I was writing stuff for them, and he called me at my little desk there and said, "Wow, you can really write, but there's like only three transsexual people in the world, right? Who would buy this book?" I'm like, I'm like, you are so wrong about that. First of all, there's a lot more people who are transsexual and otherwise who are engaged in, this existence, and there's going to be a lot more. You you have no idea. I can just tell you right now, and I have no proof, but I know in my gut it's coming.
The
And
box is about to open. Yes.
right. And I couldn't believe that he had told me that because he was actually the editor who was responsible for making the world of gay fiction, gay literature. Prior to that, prior to his intervention and saying, no, there is a market for real literature that is gay themed or gay focused. Um, Prior to that, it was nothing but pulp fiction, basically, just trash novels, you know, 10 cents a pop. And
And very high literature that could be interpreted in meaningful gay ways, but that was hadn't happened, or that was kind of just happening in the academy, right? Where you start to get sort of gay and lesbian literary studies and later queer theory, where it's like, how do we read Marcel Proust, right? How do we read people who are gay and were gay but didn't tell their
right.
stories openly? Yeah.
Yeah, and the literary marketplace was closed to us. So, and there he was just telling me, yeah, well, it's open for gay people now, but it's not open for trans people because there aren't any.
So
So,
I'm going to pause you for a second because you used the word transsexual, which we know the Youngs don't particularly appreciate or like. And
which
one
is
of
a
the
shame
one
because
of the things that
it's a valid
oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
it's a valid term, and it's an identity label for many thousands of people around the world. It's this American culture is not the only place where trans people live. And I think it's really unfair for people to deny other people's identity labels. I just think that's a wrong choice for people in our position.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, I mean, one of the memories that came up thinking about Lynn was that she was very active, right? Visible trans woman and was kind of notoriously fierce. And so one of the chapters of my first book, which was largely about cross-dressers, was about people who transition. And so I had her read because I thought that's what you want as like the angriest, most sensitive person, to make sure you don't fuck it up. And so um, I had her read, and she actually sent me a bunch of corrections. She also sent me a picture of her and her husband for the book, so that was very sweet. But it's really fascinating to me thinking about the divides that we grew up with. So I felt like I was reaching across time and space, right, to talk to a trans woman because I work mostly with the cross-dressing community, and yet I think about the similar time and space that the now I'm going to use some old school language, FTM and MTF communities, right, had. And I know nobody uses any of that anymore, but this is the language we lived in. I once in a while, when I'm teaching, I have to say to students, like, look, we were making it all up as we went. Like nobody knew how to use any of this language. No one knew what terms we should use, and frankly, language that was used within the community was meant to be obviously not the stuff that was pathologizing or from outside doctors. Granted, we have more friendly trans affirming doctors than we certainly used to, but at the time, it was really the community arguing amongst itself often about what language was cool. Do you remember any specific like stories for when language significantly changed or shifted, or the day that you woke up and went, "Wait, that's I'm not supposed to use that anymore"? What? Yeah.
Well, um, well, I remember very clearly when transgender, which was had been around for quite a while, be suddenly clicked and became popular. And a lot of people, myself included, uh, thought it was a great word, but not our word. It was fine. I personally feel I never changed my gender. Transgender meant across gender, which was fine. I I feel that I've been across gender. That's, I mean, I live still in a sort of across gender space, and so that's okay. I ultimately began to advocate for for using the term transgender because it was less threatening than transsexual to the mainstream people whom we were trying to educate, and to whom we were trying to appeal for our rights
Yeah.
as human beings. And that's literally what we were doing.
There's
And
and there's also that complication of sex and sex. I think people hear sex and they think
exactly,
sexuality when in fact we were just trying to talk about bodies specifically. But yeah,
exactly. And that's everybody was afraid of the word sex. Sexuality is a threatening term. We don't want to talk about in public spaces. It's not a nice topic, which I disagree with. But if you're going to make some headway, there's sometimes you have to make some compromises along the way in order to be heard, if nothing else. And so I started ended up taking some heat in the transsexual world for not insisting on that be the word that is used. And I've always said it's a perfectly good word. There's nothing wrong. I personally identify as a transsexual person. I can adapt to the using the word transgender. That's fine. But what I went through medically, surgically, uh, had nothing to do with my gender. And so, how am I communicating to other people? What am I telling people about myself when I say use the term transgender? There's a lot of things that work, but a lot of things that don't. And for me, the medical piece was important. And I think for a lot of people looking for access to care, um, the medical piece was very, very important. And all the literature up to that point and anything that justified our medical ability to transition was rooted in the term transsexual.
Yeah, and you think about, I mean, at the current political moment, it's I think of like the two big categories of attack, and one is drag queens, so temporary cross gender representation, as well as medical access, right? So those are the two big fronts of attack. So in a weird way, I look back and I go, well, has anything actually changed? Because even though we had these divides, the reality is they're still there. I was just chatting on Facebook with Angela Brightfeather, and was saying like the gender community seems to make more sense
Yes.
to people because then it includes everybody. So um,
Yeah. And that's what we used to call it, the gender community, not the transgender community.
well, and that honestly, that makes way more sense for me as someone who had very politely just put my gender in my back pocket at some point. I really just tried to ignore it as much as I could, and then, lived how I lived. But then, of course, I met my wife, and all of a sudden, at almost 30 years old, I was like, great, now I have to look at my gender. I don't want to think about my gender anymore. I'm done. I took my feminist theory classes. I don't want to think about this, but I got dragged
Mhm.
into it. And then, of course, the more and more you do the work, it really became something that I had read all this feminist theory and queer theory, and I was like, and then meeting cross-dressers and going, you're the ones who got, you need this theory, like you, this is liberatory theory in the bell hooks sense, and yet nobody knew it. And I thought, well, I can translate these ideas, this isn't, so I joke that my books are more translation than they are original, but um interpretive translation at least, because it was just so frustrating to talk to people who were miserable, felt like they had no rights, couldn't be out at a time, we're talking about the early aughts. So yeah, I mean, in terms
Yeah.
of
And I,
seismic shifts, I think that's a big one. So transgender becomes the sort of umbrella term for the community. Any
yeah.
guesses? Do you remember what year about that was? I think it's around when our books came out.
Well, actually, we used that term in this 1994 um, City of San Francisco Human Rights Commission report on discrimination against transgender people. And that's what got us their first law protecting people on the basis of gender identity and expression, and also um, started the road to uh, getting health care coverage, getting exclusions removed from insurance policies.
That is a moment, I feel like a historical moment to talk about, because it's the first policy right anywhere in the United States. I'm going to ask
Well,
you,
no, it
who was
wasn't.
on that commission?
Well, first of all, it wasn't the very first thing that happened in the United States.
Okay,
There were other things that happened earlier. Many things happened in the 1970s.
right.
ACLU started their first. Actually, it was at that time it was a transsexual rights uh, special interest group within ACLU, and Jude Patton was one of the members of that group, and also Sister Mary Elizabeth, who at that time was known as Joanna Clark. Um,
Wow.
so Jude and Joanna and another trans woman, maybe one or two other trans women, were involved in the 70s, and they got um, the driver's license policies changed in California. So as early as 1974
Wow.
or 76, roughly, um, California's Department of Motor Vehicles had a form that would allow people to change their gender on their driver's licenses with a doctor's note. So, so that was early.
Well,
There
driver's
were a lot.
licenses in particular, I feel like that's always been one of the most practical, right, things that you can get changed, and that in different states it can be so complicated to get changed. I mean, birth certificates aside, I know I will be interviewing Paisley at some point just to talk about the sort of legal ramifications, and I am now talking to Jude, so thank you for mentioning him, because I think he's now
Yes,
on
you
the list
should.
as well. But
And also
um,
Paisley's great, but Paisley's work mostly focuses on New York State. Very different legal environments. between California and New York, especially in the 1970s
Yeah,
when
and
this
they're
started.
fascinating. Some of the stories that he's also dug up over time over how the changes started to happen. Um, but yeah, so California as well. So you would think in terms of, so it's really the first NDA for trans people in a city, the San Francisco law.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
right.
So that makes more sense, right? For non-discrimination.
Actually, in the state of Minnesota had the first law, but it was hidden. The existence of trans people was deeply hidden in the definition of sex.
Wow.
So they had discrimination against sex, and it included transsexual people, but it was not advertised, it was not visible, it was not in any public facing documents other than what you could look up if you wanted to look at the history of the law. But it was very closeted. But it was there, but it didn't seem to have that much of a positive effect because people weren't aware of it.
I'm wondering, as you mentioned, Paisley, right, being New York centric, and of course, I never noticed someone being New York centric because I have myself big blinders there. But the I wonder if anyone has written more of the specific legal history, like California, Minnesota, because there are a couple of interesting laws that happen in the U.S. Like, but I can't think off the top of my head of like someone who's actually done that, maybe done the state by state breakdown of how things changed.
But we started to do that in the 90s, but there's a one of the women who I believe um, was on that 1974 period or 1970s period ACLU group has recently published, self-published, I believe, a document that basically goes through a lot of that. But
Wow.
it's not the best written thing in the world. But it's a valuable resource. I actually have it over here on my bookshelf if you want me to
Awesome.
go get it.
Please do. I was gonna say, and as I publish these to YouTube, I'm hoping that we can get sort of good books and resource lists together as part of this
Yeah.
series. So, hey, James is like the coolest person in the world. So, um, really,
Where is
absolutely.
it? Okay, I can't find it right now.
See, this is what happens when you get people together to talk about things. Like, let me just spend a minute trying to find this resource. Um, that's
I can't
this
find it,
is
but it's over there somewhere.
over there. So, oh, you only have a couple of books, right? So,
Yeah.
um, it's fantastic. And I've never set up my office to actually do that. I have a whole bunch of books to the right of me. So if I turn my screen, but it's a giant computer screen, so I'm not going to mess with it doing this. But I have a little collection. So like that whole top shelf behind me is everything I've published, which is, a tiny little stack, but anthologies and stuff that I've appeared in. And
Right.
you were in everything. I will say that when I first kind of got again on the scene, it was like every documentary I picked up, every interview with anybody, any like news special, any everything, um which was always lovely because the reality is we were always an interesting mix of people, talking heads, when it came to this stuff, certainly in the early aughts. And you were always your charming, brilliant self. So thank you for that. The one thing I did want to do, and I think this is a fascinating history, is that the links, right, to the real originals, whether we're talking Benjamin or Magnus Hirschfeld or Lily Elbe, whatever, is that I always think, oh, do we have a 6 degrees of separation, right, effectively in the trans world? Because you inherited FTM International, and I know that other sort of people who, like, people are always shocked when I tell them I met Virginia Prince. Like, we were at a conference together, we had lovely conversations, which was funny. We got along amazingly well, and everybody was like, "But you don't like
Yeah.
anything she did?" And I was like, "But she has done amazing work despite being cranky and oddly transphobic and a whole bunch of other things. She was
Yes,
still
and
a
she's also
pioneer, and she
very,
should
very
be recognized
intelligent.
as such.
Yeah, she was very, very intelligent, and she fought very hard for us in many ways, is as obstructionist as she was at the same time. I mean, Dallas Denny um, is publishing a book, I think through transgender publishing in Canada, Margot Wilson's publishing company,
Okay,
that is focused completely on Virginia. And
really?
also, we have a chapter about her. Well, actually, we have a book coming out in February of 2025 from SUNY Press called A History of Transgender Medicine in the United States. From Margins to Mainstream is the subtitle. It's co-edited by Carolyn Wolf Gould, MD, and Dallas Denny, and myself and Kyan Lynch, MD. Um, Three of us are trans. Carolyn is the only one who's a cisgender person, and two of us are MDs, uh, and then there's Dallas and me, of course.
Yeah, I know, but better
But
talent you couldn't get. So Dallas is, of course, also one of the people I will be interviewing. So,
yeah,
um,
Dallas is definitely somebody. She actually came on the scene about a year after I did, but she struggled mightily and reached out very early to Virginia, looking because Virginia was visible and there was nobody else, and
right.
she's begging for a referral to a medical program. And of course, Virginia wrote her this nasty letter telling her how she should never change her body, and all these things. So
Imperfect pioneers. So that's certainly part of it. But yes, I mean, then of course Dallas went on to create all sorts of life-saving resources too. So,
absolutely, and
uh,
she and I have worked together on many projects and co-authored a few chapters and other anthologies and stuff. And we're also working on another anthology about with Ms. Bob Davis from California, who runs the Louise Lawrence Transgender Archive. And
and
that
where is that
archive
out of?
is it's in Vallejo, California. Ms. Bob was a music teacher, music instructor at at City College of San Francisco for many, many years and recently retired, and is a fascinating person in her own right. And that she and Dallas and I are co-editing a chapter on that. I mean, a book on how trans people from the 1940s up to 2000, how trans people learned to find each other and talk to each other.
This is a topic that is ultimately fascinating. I teach, undergrads, and so the notion that like I had a student recently say to me, "Well, like, how did you find out about new music?" And it was like, "Oh, like you guys have always had all of this right in your hands." And so the idea of like going, well, you found out about a band, you went to go see a band, you stood in line for tickets, you ended up talking to people, you went to like store kind of things and browsed records for a long time in the right section so you could maybe meet somebody else who had similar taste and magazines and all of this other stuff. But this art of like, how do you find people, how do you find resources when there was no internet, I think is amazing. I was just thinking that the
I,
biggest generational divide is really the generation that had to decide to get a cell phone and the
right.
generations that were just born with them effectively. So
Yeah.
yikes.
And that first conference, the first trans masculine conference that we put on in San Francisco in 1995, where we had almost 400 people, that was all done without any internet, you know?
It's amazing. Yes, like
Yeah.
letters and newsletter. I still have a couple of really lovely vintage FTM international newsletters tucked away. That someone who was moving after they transition mailed to me figured I would, and I do try to collect as much of the stuff as I can find instead of letting people throw anything out. Um, there's, you know, always a little bit of a librarian in every writer, right? So,
Yep, that's
can you tell
true.
me about that conference? And actually, I would love to hear the story of how you ended up running FTM International. I've mentioned it, but
Well, let's start there because that's earlier. I ended up running FTM International, which wasn't called FTM International at the time. It was called FTM. And that was Lou Sullivan's support group that he started in 1987. At the end of 1987, he had one meeting in 87. And then he had he was trying to do it quarterly, just like he was trying to do his newsletter on a quarterly basis. The newsletter actually began in 86. And so he he was just he was trying to connect people because he was sitting in San Francisco in the 70s thinking he was the only one who felt like himself. And then he saw a newspaper article, or maybe it was a television news spot. I'm not sure um, at the moment. I can probably find out, but um, about Steve Dain, who in 1976 was basically he was a high school girls PE teacher, and he transitioned over the summer 1 year between school years, came back as a man, fully expecting to continue teaching girls PE in the 1970s, and
optimism.
the students loved him. He told me the parents were totally supportive of him. It was the administration that freaked out, most of whom had never met him. Um, the administrators at the school were under the thumb of the administrators in the district. And so even though they knew him and might speak up in favor of him, they were completely outnumbered by administrators and people in other districts who didn't know him. And he fought, and that's he became the most famous trans man in America um, for quite some time. He was the only famous trans man in America. And Lou Sullivan sitting in Emeryville. He was in Emeryville, California, which is right across the bay. It's on the exact other side of the San Francisco Oakland Bay Bridge. Um, and there's Lou sitting in San Francisco going, "Oh, I'm not the only one. Here's somebody else who feels this way." But he did something about it. Oh my gosh, I've got to talk to him. And he trying to figure out how to find him and how to reach him. And he ultimately found out from a therapist in San Francisco who knew Steve and told him to reach out to him, gave him the contact info. And Steve mentored him through his transition in the late 70s, early 80s. He was still it took him a long time um, to go through that transition, and he he was not allowed to transition at first because the gender clinic felt that it was wrong to be homosexual. If, in other words, if he wanted to be in relationship with men, he should just stay in a woman's body because that's, the whole purpose of this transition, according to them at the time, was to make you normal. So,
Good luck with that.
yeah, good luck with that. None of us ever are normal. We might be more normal than somebody else, but we're not normal like anybody who doesn't go through this.
More, or at least more heterosexual. Some people are more heterosexual than others, but yes, I mean,
Right,
I honestly, Bryce Smith, who's a local author here in Wisconsin, because Lou Sullivan's from here, wrote a
right.
nice book about him, and I found it just still mind blowing. The idea that he was theorizing an identity that effectively, I mean, it had existed in the world. There had been other trans men, certainly, and there had been other gay trans men, even, but if you had no access to that information. So he's like independently alone trying
Yep,
to theorize an identity that not only didn't exist anywhere in the world, certainly not locally to him, either in Wisconsin or California. But then as
That's right.
well was absolutely verboten even to the medical community that was sort of willing to help people transition, right? So restrictive. I mean, I remember Rachel and I being told that so many weird things back in the day, that like first we should get divorced, second she would never really be a woman if she stayed married to me. Like there were a lot of people who still had a lot of this inherited, I would argue, transphobic information, but it came from the clinics, right? It came from
That's right.
even the most friendly, willing people were like, we're not making gay trans men. That is just not a thing that's going to happen. And
Right.
likewise for the women who wanted to partner with women. And now it's like trans lesbians are everywhere. But yeah, it's, I mean, that whole idea just sort of blew my mind. Like the
Yeah.
concept of being other. I was just talking to other queer friends about this too, that how so much queerness, depending on if you identify as queer, um, big umbrella version, like when you at some point realize that you're different but you don't have a word for it, and how much more difficult it was to find that word. Rachel always tells the story of finding the word transvestite and kind of going, at least there's a word, I guess. That means something other people like me perhaps exist, but
Yeah.
very little. And all of it written right from a
I
negative
just published
standpoint.
a little personal essay in a collection of course I'm looking for it now. It's in a pile over there. A collection of stories called um, Defining Moments, and then subtitle Essential Queer Stories.
Mm,
So it's all gay, all queer authors. And my story is in there, and it talks about recognizing from like age 3 that I was different, and struggling with being adopted, and what is my relationship with my parents, and because I'm different, and all this stuff. And then going through like being in grade school and wanting to wear boys' clothes, and of course that was not allowed when I was young. For you could girls couldn't wear jeans or t-shirts to school. I mean, that was just not done. And I have a bunch of little stories in there about different things that happened to me over time, and then coming to find in my own head the term cross-gendered. Walking across, I was by that time I was in the university at University of Oregon, walking across the campus one day and going, cross-gendered, that's what's wrong with me. I have a gender in my brain that's different from the gender in my body, and like wires are crossed in between my head and my body. That's what it is. And I went to my class and kept thinking about it. And I went back to the dorm, and guess what? I'm cross-gendered. And all my friends went, yeah, okay.
sure. What else is new? I know a friend of mine always
Yeah,
used to say to me that it was like, well, we know you're queer, we just don't know how.
right.
Fair. And but I think the trans movement in general brought this conversation. I joke a lot about how when we see, say, asexual movement talking about the difference between, say, romantic and sexual attraction, like that's an important theoretical step that happened, and that's because of the ace folks. But trans,
Yep.
this whole idea that you could be queer because of who you were attracted to, but you could also be queer just because of your gender, which I think was sort of tacitly acknowledged in gay community, though often stuffed down as well, right? No
Yeah,
feminine gay
well, and
men were
particularly
possible.
when I think about again the 1970s, that right after Stonewall, there was big, and people have said nothing happened before Stonewall. That's not true. A lot of stuff was happening in the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, but none of it really organized in a political way until um, the 50s, with Frank Kameni's protests from being fired from the federal government. But again, after Stonewall, which was a pivotal, seminal moment, but not the moment, it was just
Thank you for
another
conceding
one.
that little bit to New York. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just because it happened in New York, okay, fine, whatever. So um, basically, when the gay movement organizations really started hustling, and they cut out people who looked not normal. They didn't want anybody in leather. They didn't want anybody who like masculine women, super butch women. They didn't want super effeminate men either.
Well, Sylvia Rivera gets uninvited by the very first march, the first parade march. I know that's a debated term too, but like her and Marsha P. Johnson are doing that amazing work, and they're also
Yep.
just cut out. They have to set up a different stage to speak. I mean, luckily there's video of that. Um,
Yeah.
Historically, I saw it for the first time a couple of years ago and went, "Who had the
Yeah.
wisdom to make sure that was recorded?" I'm glad somebody did, though.
Yeah. I met Sylvia toward the end of her life. She was pretty ill at the time,
Yeah.
but I was able to meet her, and I did hang out in New York for a little while, now and then, special events. And I was invited to speak. Leslie Feinberg and I spoke at Sylvia's memorial service in New York,
Yeah,
which was great.
that just predated me. And the interesting thing is that, of course, Rachel and I were living almost around the corner from Transy House, in Brooklyn, which, of course, I didn't know when I moved there, but then came. And of course,
Right.
Chelsea is on the list as well. But
Yeah,
um,
Chelsea. Yeah. Chelsea and Rusty, they were fabulous.
yeah,
Fabulous. Well, Chelsea still is.
and always fantastically dressed. So I used to see them and just go, "Oh, this is, yeah." I was just saying I was at a Pride event because tall drag queens, and I said, it's just part of my thing in the trans world. I like being around tall ladies. I have always liked being around tall ladies, and I get a much better percentage of them in trans community. So, um,
Yeah.
it's really really true. So, in terms of your influences, and thinking again about like the 6 degrees of separation, like who were the people who mentored you, if there were people who mentored you, because I think in some cases people had to just make stuff up out of whole cloth. And was there any other sort of story or person, trans or not trans, who basically influenced you doing this work in the movement? I mean, working for San Francisco, writing the books.
Well, as I started out my life as a writer. I mean, I knew by the time I was 7 I was going to be a writer. So that was always on my mind, no matter what. But um I can I'll get to that. I'll come back to that. But I knew a guy who transitioned in he started his transition in 1970. I think it was 70, it might have been 76. And I wrote about this in Becoming a Visible Man also. But he's very closeted, and I will not mention his name. And but he was a friend, and he had gone off to New York City, where he found a flyer that because his girlfriend was going to be a famous Broadway star, and so they went off. They left Oregon and drove across the country in their Jeep. I think they had a Jeep at that time, and you know gonna do the New York thing. Well, it didn't quite work out, but he in the green room while he was waiting for her to finish some performance found a flyer with one of these, those tear off tabs, with a phone number you call. This is the 70s. And they were looking for 12 FTMs to be in a program at the University of Oregon Health Sciences Center in Portland. And he was from Oregon. And so he thought, oh, and he called the number and he immediately got started on hormones. And he wrote me a letter and he said, "You should do this. You would love this. This is great." And I'm like, interesting. Well, I have been thinking about it, but I didn't know it was really possible. I didn't know how you would go about it. I didn't know anyone who had done it. And now here's somebody who's getting started. So, okay, well, I'll watch this and I'll see what I think. And they came back to Oregon. I was living in Portland at the time. Um, escaping from the Bay Area where my parents would have made me, get a job, and that was an appropriate job for a young woman and wear appropriate young woman clothes.
Ugh,
So I get to stay
that had to
away
be
from
even
the Bay
worse
Area
than,
for,
yeah. I
yeah,
suffered with that even in the 90s, so I can't imagine. Hmm.
yeah, it was bad. So, I was in construction. I was wearing the clothes I wanted. I was very happy. And they come back and he says, I want you to write my story. And so I say, okay, great. Let's go to the pub. I'll bring my notebook. We'll have some beer. You can tell me your story. I'll make notes. And ultimately, what he told me didn't resonate with me in that it was, I felt, maybe it was, I know people can be inarticulate,
Hmm.
and I know that it's difficult sometimes to make sense of all this. The thing that sort of put me off was he said, now I get the respect that I deserve.
Oh,
And I thought there's nothing wrong with being a woman. It's not, and we have to, women deserve respect. Female bodies deserve respect. We should not be going down that path. That's no reason to transition from, so I'm like, okay, that's on back burner. And
hmm,
wrote the story other than as part of my own story. Never wrote his story because I did, there wasn't enough there. And mostly because he time was incapable of actually expressing it.
yeah. I mean, in some ways, the
And
almost
he's
the opposite of Lou Sullivan, whose notebooks are just full of stories and insights and just
yes,
descriptions and just remarkable richness there. So, um, yeah, it's
so
fascinating that you can. I mean, we are both writers, and it's always fascinating to me. People can live through amazing things, but they can also live through very boring things and make them. I mean, how many amazing poets and novelists do we had who really never left the house, right? So,
right,
I think there's a difference between telling a good story and living a complicated, interesting life, right? How do you
right,
communicate the
yeah.
experience of that in particular?
But,
But
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 when I
it's
saw
always
Steve
been
Dane, when I saw Steve Dane on television, probably within the year after my friend had started his medical process, I was completely blown away by him.
right.
He was articulate, he was clear, he was confident. He just was everything I wanted to be. And and I thought, oh, I have to find this guy. Little did I know. I mean, it took me 10 years, more than 10 years to find him.
Wow.
It took me 12 years to find him. And found out we grew up in neighborhoods right adjacent to each other. If a new high school hadn't been built that and the line drawn in a certain place for who went to that high school, we would have gone to all the same junior high, high school
Wow.
stuff, but he was 11 years older than me, so we our paths probably wouldn't have crossed anyway, but in the school setting like that. But yeah, and he
Well, but
lived
PE,
all these
where was he
pictures.
teaching gym?
Sorry.
So where was he teaching? Maybe you would have ended up being in one of his classes.
Oh no, he was teaching it in Emeryville, and that's another city.
Gotcha.
And yeah, I wouldn't have been sent to that school. But he got degrees in physical education and stuff and at UC Berkeley, and he presented as a woman much much more effectively than I ever could. And he knew how to set his hair and put on makeup and all that stuff. And so he was really trying hard to be, accepted as a woman, and he just couldn't do it. And I couldn't even go as far as he did in trying to be accepted as a woman. That just was not possible. It just wasn't in me.
Yeah.
And much as I love women, I think women are incredible. It's not, people used to say to my ex, Oh, well, he's doing that. He must hate himself. He must hate you. He must hate women. And no, that is not what this is about.
And yet
So his
that's still a thing that I think, is heard in certain places as well, that the urge to transition is some sort of self-hating mechanism, blah blah blah. But yeah, no, of course not the case. I mean, it's interesting too because the the amazing thing about meeting, and I've been talking to a lot of cis men about this too, but I think what's remarkable is when you're transitioning as more like an adult, you are thinking about, well, what version of man do I want to be? And if you're coming to masculinity and being a man from feminism, right? That's a whole different version. So I would say, like, thank you all, because I feel like the models, as much as I joke that Rachel and I being married, the sky didn't come crashing in, right? We were proof that two women could be married without the world imploding or whatever, being struck by lightning, whatever version of that. I think as well, presenting versions of non-toxic masculinity. That's not to say that there aren't toxically masculine trans men, because I've certainly met a few,
Yeah,
but the
there are.
reality is this, that kind of self-awareness and choice making, I think that trans men do in considering.
I think it's a gift that we have available to us, and we could do a lot more with it that would be helpful for society. And I think we should ultimately do that work.
Well, and the bigger gift as well, I think, to the rest of the world. I've always said that, being in trans community for me was always a contact high. Like once you're talking around people who have done such work on liberating themselves from whatever gender constraints they have, you can't not do it for yourself too, right? So as much as my meeting my wife was like, oh, I don't want to think about gender anymore, it's like the reality is it had to be done. I'd say once a decade, right? You often your gender gets reconsidered, especially as hormones change with age, essentially, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes on. um
Yeah.
so yeah, but it's always in I feel like the work I've done has always been out of like gratitude for the fact that this is a community that has always been interested in everybody's liberation from restrictions
Yeah.
of gender, and not just trans people's, and
Right.
trying to
That's
get
right.
that across to people.
Yeah.
um I feel like I'm going to ask you that, since we've got like 10 minutes, we could keep going, but I know you have another thing, busy person.
Oh
um
no, I've got plenty of time.
oh good,
I,
then let's keep going. Good.
yeah. But you had
I
asked me about influences and how did we get to the conference and how all that kind of jazz.
Yes,
You want
so
me to go
I'm
on
just going to shut up and let you
with
tell
that?
that story. So
Oh, excuse me. Well, um, I was actually working on a novel about a couple of female-bodied people who are friends who are separately and together thinking about transition and in the 70s. And and so I was doing some research on that, and I found a little magazine called The Transsexual Voice that was published in out of Atlanta by a trans woman named Phoebe Smith. And through that, that's how I found Lou Sullivan. He had put a little ad for his book, his little pamphlet called Information for the Transsexual and Crossdresser, Female to Male Crossdresser and Transsexual, I guess it was. Information for the Female to Male Crossdresser and Transsexual. And send $5, L. Sullivan, Post Office Box, San Francisco. So I said, well, right across the bay. Okay, because by that time I'm living in the East Bay where I was born and raised. And and so I sent my $5, and Lou wrote me because I was local, wrote me a really nice note and invited me to be if I, to have a conversation with him if I was interested in coming to their meetings that they were just starting to have. And when I say they, but excuse me, there were probably about six regulars who went to his meetings. I mean, it was not a big group. He was just starting, and he was very well connected with the local cross-dressing groups, which were much larger. And that's where he learned a lot of things about how to organize and run a meeting and that sort of thing. But anyway, yeah, it took me a while because I'm shy about making phone calls to people I don't know, but ultimately I did reach out to Lou and we had a lovely conversation on the phone. And he told me that Steve Dain was going to be the speaker at the next meeting. And I'm like, I'm there. I'm there because I've got to meet that guy. And um, so yeah, that was that meeting, which was in March of 1987, was the first time I met Lou in person and the first time I met Steve. And Steve asked me, after he spoke to this large group, I mean, there's 50 or 60 people there. I mean, it was stunning. And I was like blown away. I was like, there's a lot of guys here. And then I realized, oh, they were trans men. I didn't, but I didn't know. I'd never seen a bunch of trans men before, so and there were a lot of them brought their partners, and so it wasn't all trans men in the room. It was a very mixed group, and it was also racially mixed. It was very the group in the early days was very racially mixed and was great. And um anyway, I walked up to Steve afterward and realized I was actually a little taller than him. And I'm not taller than anybody. And this guy is so powerful. He's so powerful looking. He's like super muscular and stuff. And I was like, whoa. And he's just confident. And I'm like this little mousy thing. And well, sort of. Not really, but yeah, I felt like a mousy thing. And and he says, so when did you start taking hormones? And I said, I haven't. And then his wife, who had been in the back of the room, came up and she goes, when did you have your top surgery? And I said, I haven't. And they both were like, whoa. And I said, I really, really need to talk with you. I need to talk with you deeply on a regular basis. I need to ask you a lot of questions. And he goes, great, let's do it. And we asked, that's when we found out, a little small talk, found out we grew up close to each other. And he goes, oh, it must be something in the water.
Yeah. That's what we thought when we realized we were around the corner from Transy House. It was like, okay. I mean,
Yeah.
that part of Park Slope was often referred to as Dyke Slope too. So yeah, it certainly had its a vibe, as the kids say.
One of the things that he made me do or asked me to do in preparation as I had already written to the sex reassignment program at Stanford and asked for their application. I'd already had it in my desk for almost 2 years. I was scared to death to fill it out. And, I talked to Steve about, should I really do this? Went back and forth with all these things. Finally, he said, look, you're a writer. Why don't you sit down, go home, sit down, write the scene in which you tell your parents? That was, and I did it, and it was an extraordinarily powerful experience. I cried the whole time I was writing. I was so scared. And I imagined what I would say, what they would say, just went through the whole thing. And ultimately realized, yes, I do need to do this.
What
So
an
it was
amazing gift
amazing.
he gave you in that exercise. I mean, on
Yeah.
so many different levels, right? It's the
Yeah.
actualization, it's the what is the biggest fear? What is the how did your parents respond? I mean, you transitioned early, so this was not a
Not
common
that
topic.
early.
It's still difficult, but yeah.
Well, I'm not that early in I was 40 years old when I transitioned. So, I'll be 76 this year. And so I was pretty well established in my adulthood. And my father had passed away suddenly as I was in the process of thinking about it. So I never got to talk with him about it. And that's one regret that I have, that my father never knew that, because well, he was pretty amazing. He was a conservative guy. He was a Nixon Reagan Republican. We argued all through the Vietnam War. I mean, it was, you know, but I never ever doubted that he loved me and that he respected me. And he said to me things that were very encouraging, like, you know, you have the capacity to do whatever you want to do. He said at one point, he said to me, your brother will rise to he will get a corporate job and he'll rise to a certain level and that'll be it. And he'll be there and then he'll be done. And then you know, that'll be his life. You can do whatever you want to do.
Oh,
And and then when I came out as a lesbian, a few years, well, yeah, I guess when I was in my early 30s, I told my parents I was in a relationship with a woman, that we were going to have a baby. And you know, my mother totally flipped out, and my father sat there very quietly. And he had said a lot of homophobic things when I was growing up, mostly worrying about the fact that my brother really liked Ray Bolger's dancing as the scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz. My brother was fascinated by that. And so my dad interpreted that as he was going to be gay.
wow. Okay, that's one gay diagnostic I have never heard. A thing for the
Right.
Scarecrow and the Wizard of Oz. I mean, like the Wizard of Oz is also a little trans, but never mind. That's a whole other story.
Yeah,
But that's
that's
hilarious.
right.
Okay. Like that you
Yeah.
try to
So,
explain to people like what people have been told about like what makes you get. I mean, I always explain the earrings to people. I was like, you had to have one in both ear and you could only have extras in the left. And I don't know where any of those rules came from, but yes, it was like you
no,
might do something
crazy.
accidentally and then you'd be gay, or that's how other people thought you were gay. Who the knows? Yeah,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
wild.
If you wore green on Thursdays, that meant you were gay. Yeah. That was when I was in grade school.
Wait, that
So
you're
anyway,
actually you're
so when
serious. I thought you
so
were just making something up
I
randomly.
told them I was sorry.
I said I thought you were making something up randomly, but green on Thursdays was actually a thing.
Yeah, it was back in the 50s when I was in grade school. Yeah.
Whoosh.
Yeah. I'm like, what? What does that mean? Anyway, so my father, when my mother was ranting about how horrible it was that, she was using me, she's taking advantage of me, all this stuff that, shouldn't be a lesbian, blah, blah, blah. My dad was uncharacteristically quiet. And then he waited for her to calm down. And then he said, I'm sorry if my attitudes made it so difficult for you to tell me something so important about who you are. That totally blew me away.
That's wow.
And so he's like he was my role model. He was my hero in that way.
That's remarkable. I mean, it's
Yeah.
when we came out to my family in particular, my parents who were 80 something year old Catholic, practicing Catholics, quite religious Catholics actually. My
Mhm.
dad said, "We'll never let anyone treat you like a second class citizen." And really never said anything else about it, but got that out. So,
That's
yeah, really
that's a
remarkable.
big yeah, that's a big one. That's
Um,
really important. That's great.
well, that was to some degree his thing. He was a complicated man, but also had, I would say not someone who used slurs for people ever, but he was Italian American growing up and was assumed to be black and or Jewish, depending on the day. Um, but yeah, different, very different mindset, very different. I mean, social justice Catholics, I think, are disappearing very, very quickly, but they were both of my parents were in that category. So, um,
Yeah. I grew up across the street from a big Catholic social justice Catholic family. They were great. Best neighbors in the world.
Awesome. Were you raised within religion? I mean, in the 50s, I think everybody was, but I'm curious if they were more or less or.
My dad was very attracted to Zen Buddhism. My mom was a born and raised Protestant. My dad's mom was a Lutheran. He didn't like that. He took me once before I had a driver's license to a friend's wedding in a Catholic church. It was a high mass, and he whispered into my ear the whole time about how it was barbaric. And he told me that he really objected to the fact that you couldn't have your own relationship with God in that faith. That your relationship with God had to be through the priest, and that was wrong, is in his opinion. So
Well, I mean, that's
we
the
went
core of Protestant. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, but
we
not
went
necessarily
yeah,
true, but it is, I know what
no,
people didn't believe about
I
Catholicism. So,
that's what people get told. Yeah. So we were, but my dad worked in a business that was an industry that was predominantly Jewish. And so he had a yarmulke and he spoke some Yiddish, and he was often invited to his colleagues' kids' bar mitzvahs and stuff like that. So, and we were told, my brother and I were told to always respect other people's religions, not, you don't judge people based on their faith. And, and they said to us, we don't care what faith you choose. You're welcome to choose your own faith. you know, we're taking you to this church here because it's local. It's close by. It's a nice community. That church is for community. So, but you don't have to continue to be in that faith. Just be aware that there's something out there that's bigger than you. That's all. And be kind to people. Those were the values. We had we had a
those are
I
hard,
had a
you know.
Japanese yeah, yeah. I had a Japanese aunt who I loved, and I had lots of friends from all over all the different neighborhoods of Oakland who I loved. And so I was blessed to have a very diverse world around me that I was part of.
Yeah. I mean, the Bay Area, I feel like that was also so much the case or known to be the case. The coastal cities, especially, right, have that quality. I found that out at some point in the Midwest. They refer to both people from San Francisco, LA, and New York as we're all coasties out here, which is
Yeah,
hilarious. So it's like the Midwest just leveling all of the differences and, whatever.
yeah,
Um,
right.
I'm gonna
But
ask you a couple of other questions. My thought is that I would like to make sure I ask some of the same question to various different people that I'm going to be talking to.
you're good idea.
Um, so what is your biggest victory? That could be in terms of trans political stuff, that could be personal, that could be whatever.
Well, really, I think in terms of political stuff, I think it was my quest to remove exclusions from healthcare plans and um, to prove that offering this care didn't increase costs, and to get public health to embrace it. And there were a lot of elements that was a multi-year, almost 2-decade fight. There were a lot of elements involved, and people still will say, well, when we got Obamacare, then we got coverage. No, that's not how it happened. The reason Obamacare included coverage was because by that time we had trans activists and other social justice minded people who were aware of trans issues and not trans themselves embedded within the administration who were willing to fight for us. That's that happened because of the work that I did in conjunction with the city of San Francisco first, and then the Human Rights Campaign's Business Council and the Corporate Equality Index. And then my colleague Andre Wilson and I went to the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, uh, meetings where at the beginning of that organization, they excluded trans physicians from being members. And there was a big protest about that. Um, and so getting acceptance for trans people, trans providers of medical care, and then trans care itself into the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association was something that I was much engaged in. And also increasing the capacity of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which when I joined, it was called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association.
A big duh.
Um, Getting them do more on behalf of trans people's health care to increase the number of doctors available. Because if we were going to win on insurance, we needed more doctors. So, but
When
also
does the
within
Harry
the Gay and
Benjamin
Lesbian Medical
Association
is,
become WPATH? I forget what, do you know what year that was?
well, we decided, we made the board decided to do that in 2006. I don't think it was ratified by the full membership until 2009,
Okay.
but it was a very slow moving organization in those days, much slower than it is now. But um, the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association was where we had our first contact with people from the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare and Medicaid Services, uh, part of Health and Human Services, and made the case there for trans inclusion and asked them to start working on it, and they did. So by 2014, which was when CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, decided to lift their restriction on paying for surgery, which they at that time it was still called transsexual surgery. Um, that was when Obamacare was in process, and that's how it got into Obamacare and got into the whole business about Medicaid expansions,
Mhm.
which went into effect on the initiation of Obamacare and well, the Affordable Care Act. So that would not have happened spontaneously. That happened because of work that began in the 1990s in the city of San Francisco. Not that people weren't also trying to do things in other parts of the country, but this was what was successful.
Yeah, that was a long process. So I knew it
Yes,
was
it
had
was.
already started long before we showed up, and yet it was so again in the beginning, right? I was mostly working with not that cross dressers never transition because of course they do, but I still get in trouble for saying that out loud, believe it or not. But the notion of like people needing access to medical care, that was not something that certainly we were immediately involved in. There was still such a big well, I mean, the story of Dallas and Virginia Prince, I think there was still such a significant idea that somehow medical transition was just going too far, or you could just live as the gender you know, all of that stuff, which yeah.
Right.
um I mean, your clarity on that in the book was certainly really helpful to me. So this notion of not being transgender specifically, um because your gender stayed the same, like that. And there's a moment I think in Julia Serrano's where she says, I think she talks about subconscious sex, right? So it was like, oh, okay, now I get it. It's not, yeah. All right. I mean, that's one of my big bugaboos is that, especially in working with, you know, dealing with TERFs or people who are new to the idea, is always like everyone thinks their gender should dictate what everybody else's gender or but you know, it's like, well, if you don't want surgery, you don't have to have it, but you don't have to be like down on the people who do, or vice versa. Like people shouldn't feel forced to
Right.
have surgery because someone has decided women can't have penises, right? You know, it's all of this stuff. Rachel and I used to joke that as much as the trans community had gotten out there, you know, there's questions you don't ask about people's bodies. The very first thing that would happen when you walked into a trans conference was everybody wanted to know what you did to your body. And I would always just be like, come on, man, like we're trying to teach the whole rest of the world not to do that. And the minute you walk into a trans conference, so the
Yep.
privacy issue as well, and I would argue the etiquette around medical transition.
Yeah. Well, and I've always advocated that, trans health involves more than transition related
Of
care.
course. Yeah.
I mean, and I've also, when it comes to, the bathroom arguments, I've also always talked about women that look like men and men that look like women, or that other people perceive as there's something wrong with their gender, that they're not trans, have problems in bathrooms too.
Yeah.
Come
I
on.
started carrying
This
my
is
birth
not just,
certificate because I got called out so many times when I was like 19. I shaved my head at some point, right? Grungy looking kid. And bathrooms, train tickets that had to be gender. Could you imagine having a train ticket that has your gender marked on it? But that was the case at the time. And I did. I didn't realize it again. It was one of those things that once Rachel and I were talking, we were having some conversation, and I had my Filofax back in the day. And she was like, "Why do you have a copy of your birth certificate in your thing?" And I was like, "Because I used to get misgendered all the time, and I had it as proof effectively." And like my mind was blown, her mind was blown. It was like, oh, I've been dealing with this for longer than I even thought. So
yeah,
um so are you at heart an optimist or a pessimist?
I'm an optimist.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I knew that
I
answer,
am
but I wanted
I
to
am a
ask people only because I
disgusting,
think pessimists sometimes also work for change, but out of a very different sort of emotional place than optimists do. So
yeah, no, I'm definitely an optimist, and sometimes I piss myself off.
fair
Either
enough. Why have I signed up to do this thing? Because it has
right.
to be done. Yes. Um,
Yeah.
absolutely. One of the best pieces of advice, I know at some point I was feeling very cranky, um, angry, bitter, whatever. I don't remember what I was going through, and I had mentioned it to you, and you said, it's okay to take a break. And I was like, oh, thank you. Like I needed permission from someone else because it was like I was just doing the thing, and it was like, because so many people, especially with the relationship stuff, like there were so few people talking about transition within a relationship that I just felt like I was just answering questions and dealing with people all the time. And then at some point I was like, oh yeah, I could just also live or maybe pay attention to my own marriage for a hot minute, all sorts of things that are good. But I forever thankful. I always pass that advice on to young people who are doing activism. I was like, James Green said you can take a break. It's a thing, and you should know that. And believe me, he worked for like 20 years on shit that had to get done. But I mean,
That's
one
great.
specific
Well,
issue even.
I always tell young activists that, you'd better pace yourself, because this is not going to be, this is going to be over next month.
Yeah.
This
And you
isn't going to
and
be
you
over
can't
next
get
year. This isn't going to be over in the next decade. This is going to be a long, long fight, because what we're talking about is a cultural paradigm shift,
yeah.
and we are engaged in it, and we may not see the end of it.
No,
I won't see the end of it.
it's a useful reminder. I always tell students that most of the people who worked for suffrage did not ever get to vote. The women who
Right,
worked on suffrage, most of the abolitionists did not see the end of slavery. So um,
right.
that's the work is in doing the work and then passing it on. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm thinking why this series came up, because I think all the time about um, how much is taken for granted, right, by younger trans, non-binary, etc. folks, which is great. Like that's how the world should be, but to also understand that it's still very recent. That a
Yeah,
lot. I mean, I'm still surprised by Obergefell. I mean, being a Supreme Court case, and I still think they're going to go after it too. But the notion
yeah.
of like change doesn't happen overnight. You often get the like 5 steps forward, seven back, two forward, one. It's like a constant movement of sort of what you need to be paying attention to.
That's
Is there
right.
something that you would tell a young activist starting out? I mean, I feel like you already answered that for me, but is there anything in additional you would add?
be kind to yourself and others. Activists sometimes can be really, really hard on themselves, push themselves too hard, too fast, too far, um, and they can be really, really mean to each other. And that does not help anybody. And it's really, really important to let other people speak, let other people say who they are. Don't trash people for being themselves. Encourage people to grow and become and learn and become stronger and more effective, and learn to pick your battles.
Yeah. And yeah, I would add to the learn to apologize. I mean, as who I was
Yes.
coming into trans community, I certainly had a lot of apologizing to do over things that, but yeah, it's like how do you I mean, your advice about sort of how do you keep the fire, right, of activism alive without it becoming destructive, without it either burning other people or even burning yourself as a result. Like, I think that's because if you don't have the fire, it's hard to do the work, but that fire can get complicated very quickly.
Yeah, I think having a larger vision than just a task, or just one bill, for example, or, one issue, even having a larger vision helps.
Sure. Um, Looking through this list of questions and thinking, how does it feel being you now, all these years later? I feel like we met now, what, 20 something years ago. Um, we've, I think, seen each other in person three times, maybe four times. Um,
Yeah,
what? Yeah, I mean, it's
yeah, I
amazing
think
to me.
about 4 times.
What? Yeah, we should. You're not by any chance going to Fantasia Fair this year, are you?
I'm in the process of trying to figure that out. I would love to be there because Dallas and Carolyn Wolf Gould are going to be there, and they want to do a session on our forthcoming book.
Awesome. We're thinking
And
about going too. So,
yeah, I'm trying to get it together to do that. Because I'm also trying to get it together to go to WPATH in Lisbon in September. So that's a lot right there to two of them. But yeah, I'm hoping that I can make both of them happen.
is
So,
there a time that you foresee not doing this work?
well, I really want to be focused much more on my writing. I have two novels that I want to get done before I'm 80, and which is not that far away. And I just would like to, have the drafts maybe in agent's hands, or, you know, in in some kind of, I don't know, maybe a contract somewhere. That would be nice. But
Okay, anyone in
I
publishing
want to
who's
write
paying
other.
attention, please. He needs a contract.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, yeah. I'm willing to consider an agent. I don't have an agent. I've never had an agent. Well, I did have an agent for in the mid 90s for a brief period of time. And after, you know, getting a lot of positive feedback, but hard no's on my proposal, the agent dropped me because clearly it wasn't going to go anywhere. So,
Yeah, I've never had an agent either. I'm always envious of people who are like, oh, well, I have my, and now I'm owned by, like, I used to have a tiny little press and now I'm owned by Hachette. So I have no ability. Like, I'd love to see updated versions of the books or at least a forward, but I'm probably not going to get those things. So I was thinking I'm going to
that's the
maybe
good
write
thing
my own
about,
forward that could, yeah,
yeah, but that's the good thing about university presses.
I
I
know.
mean, for instance, I've probably sold 15, 16, 17,000 copies of Becoming Invisible Man.
Yeah,
It happens to be Vanderbilt University Press's most best-selling book of all time.
that's awesome.
You couldn't get
Big
that kind of
fish, effectively. Yeah.
yeah, in a large press. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just
there are
going to
times I
happen.
wish I could get my rights back and sell them to someone who will help me do a new forward or an update because yeah, it's very frustrating to not feel like like they don't even know who I mean they a little they know who I am, but yeah,
Yeah, and I
different
was lucky to
experience.
get the second edition of Becoming Invisible Man in 2020.
Yes. It's great
You
too,
know,
by the way.
which yeah, and then the audiobook version came out in 2022.
Oh,
It's on
nice.
Audible.
Did you read it?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, wow, that's
And
intense.
Aaron Devor did the foreword, so I asked him to read the foreword too. So
Oh, that's cool. Aaron, that's another person on the list. Okay. Um,
yeah, definitely.
just in terms of the archives, and I knew this was going to happen. Everyone that I'm talking to is going to mention three more people that I need to chase down, but especially in terms of like running the archive and the work, because also Aaron's book was
Oh yeah.
so gigantic because it was one of the only ones out there. I mean, I tell the story all the time that when I was writing My Husband Betty, I read every book that was available on the subject, and I don't think I'm kidding. That was like 30 maybe at the time. Um, Now, what's published in a month, I can't keep up with. So,
I
and
know.
I will admit to a little
I wrote
exhaustion. I like to read things that are not about transness occasionally. So, trying to mix that up. My sister one year
yeah.
just specifically gave me books that were not about gender because she was just like, you have to read other things. Anyway,
Yes, I understand that one too. And I wrote the foreword to Aaron's book, and when he got a second edition also, which basically changed his name on the cover and changed the cover, and they asked me to write a new foreword. So that's the only new words inside the cover in his second edition is my foreword.
I was going to say, did he decide that he didn't want to change it, leave it as is for the historical
It's
record?
based on research. He had nothing. He wanted the research to stand for it by itself.
Yeah. Um, Trying to think how to ask this question, but I want you to tell a story um about something I haven't asked you about. So I know you have much storyteller in you. But maybe like an early trans community, early organization, some whatever pops into your head, whatever story you'd want to tell. I know you're already shuffling through like 15 different stories. So
I bet more than that. Um, well, let me go back to you asked this question earlier too, so I'll tell this story. I'd been going to a bunch of the conferences organized by International Foundation for Gender Education, which is predominantly cross dressers, a few transsexual women, and every once in a while a few trans men, much fewer, far fewer. Um, I mean, when they would address the crowd at a dinner or anything, it was always ladies, never ladies and gentlemen. It was just ladies.
which I was always like, I'm not a lady either, but never mind. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, right. I know. So, but yeah, it was a different world. But because Lou had started with having those connections, and they in San Francisco, when Lou passed, a bunch of our the meeting that was supposed to happen not too far from his passing had already been scheduled and the location booked and all that stuff. So everybody knew about it. Then everybody learned that he died, and then so at that meeting there were probably I don't know there were a lot of people, far more than a typical meeting, and and there were a lot of the people from the local cross-dresser group came, and they had taken up a collection and presented me with a check to keep the organization going. It was only like I don't know, maybe less than $200, but that was a lot of money in those days, and and we had no money. I mean, it's astounding what I was able to accomplish with no money and no internet. You
Yeah.
get right down to it. But
I feel like trans mask conferences were always famous for being you could go on like the fly and sleep on someone's couch. it was all that kind of queer organizing. And then like the
Yep.
ladies would always have these like show up with like six pieces of luggage and these expensive hotels. And it was like, so yeah, I know that I
This
would go to conferences and I'd find the guys because I was like, I can't do that much femininity. I get overwhelmed after a couple of days of conversations about dresses and girdles, and I mean, some of the old school cross dressers, man, can go deep. And I was like, okay, I gotta go. I gotta go find some
right.
other people. So
Yeah.
I was often the only cis woman at the table of trans guys and their partners at these big trans femme conferences. But
Yeah.
y'all saved me multiple times. So
Good. But the story I wanted to tell was about the first FTM conference,
oh,
which basically it was Dallas who gave us Dallas Denny gave us where she called me up and said, "Look, I think it's time for you guys to have a conference. You've never had a conference, a national conference. You need to do it. I'm gonna put up a I'm gonna put up $500 to the first organization that can match it. And so I want you to put this in the newsletter and don't tell your group until it's published that everybody knows at the same time. This is now we go from here we go and first group that comes up with $500, I'll give you the $500 and you can have a conference." And so that's what I did, and my group responded incredibly fast and hosted a lot of beer busts in the bear bars and all this kind of stuff, the gay male bars, and yeah, we got $500 pretty quickly.
awesome.
And so we got the right to host the conference, and we started planning it. And um thank God for or goddess for the guys who had come from the leather community, in fact, and who had participated in planning lots and lots of conferences.
Mm.
They were really on it. And without them, I don't know if how it would have happened. And also my mother got sick and died during the planning part of the conference. And we had invited Leslie Feinberg to come and give a keynote speech, and Leslie turned us down. And so I prepared a keynote speech, and then um, at the last minute, Leslie found out that my mom had died, and so came Leslie and Minnie Bruce came, and they stayed at my house, and and um, and Leslie spoke at the conference. With the program didn't even list Leslie because we didn't know, and
Yeah, and everything had to be printed way in advance in print shops. And yeah, we didn't have, yes.
yeah. And I get Lauren Cameron to show his slides. A lot of people had never seen his work before. Because this was 95. His first exhibit was in 94.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was pretty amazing. It was a pretty amazing event. And we had almost 400 people. I'm sure we had at least that many crammed into the room that and who because the capacity of the room was 400. And I know that there were people who didn't pay. I think the official paid registration was like 372 people, but I know the room was just packed. And there was a trans woman there, a local trans woman who I had done a lot of speaking with in educational contexts, and she and Susan Stryker were standing in the back of the room on the opening night when I did my keynote, and this woman says to Susan, "Wow, I've never seen so many trans men at one time before." And Susan said, "There has never been this many trans men together at one time anywhere in the history of the world. This is the first time,"
That's mind blowing.
which was true.
Yeah. Yeah, and varying ages. And as I said, you'd spoken to my classes, and one of the things that they could not get over was that you were old
Yeah.
and they had never met a bald, grayed trans guy because everybody they
Yeah.
know is young, and really our local community, is pretty small, and there's not a bunch of people. I'm sure there are trans guys who I don't know are trans around. But the reality is there's not a lot of people. And so, God, that's an amazingly mind-blowing thought of just the very first room, the first gathering.
And a
Um,
lot of people came who had never seen another trans man like themselves before.
and of course people had been transitioning just I think you were the one who used the term lawnmower transsexual as well, which was also a useful concept for me to grasp. The people who you can explain it
Well,
about it.
I said I was just gonna get my sex changed and go home and mow my lawn. Yeah.
The people who like didn't really want to be involved with transness, it was like I just need the directions, I need the prescriptions, and I'm out. Yeah. And that's still the case. I mean, there's a lot of I know like Facebook was starting out. I had quite a few friends who would not friend me on Facebook because even being a friend of Helen's, right, was a little too outing. Um, and I used to say I do have plenty of cis friends too, but yes, I can understand your nervousness because of me. Um, I mean, one of the things I find amazing still is when you just completely forget. I mean, most of the time I exist in a world where I don't it doesn't occur to me that the person I'm talking to is trans unless that happens to come up. And then it's like, oh right, because I've known some people for years and it's like, oh right, right, I forget. I forget.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, what do I even know? Oh, right, this is why I know you. Like, I occasionally have that conversation. They're like, yeah, well, I contacted you about your book, and I was like, oh, right, yeah, you too. Okay, I forget. Like, because it's. I think that's the sense of like, I mean, Rachel has always insisted that it's the least interesting. It may be an adjective used to describe her as a kind of woman, but it's really the least interesting adjective. Actor's more interesting, wife is more interesting. Like she's got a lot of other things that are more interesting about her than the transness. And I think for the most case, like I have never uh, known a trans person that is not true for, right? So there's always so much more. I mean, granted, who you like and get along with because of other affinities like writing, like spending a day at a book conference. I don't remember when that was either, but that was an awesome day. Um, And oh, this is another question I wanted to specifically ask you is that we also were in the audience when we were both nominated for a Lambda. When there was one category, let me say that again,
That's
one
right.
category for all transgender work. And you just think, I mean, that's mind blowing to think about now.
I know. And it was so frustrating for me. I gotta tell you.
Yeah. Well, you'd flown in too, so
Yeah.
yeah. Award ceremonies are dumb, it turns out, but I didn't know that yet either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
I
the
have
funny
other
thing
things
is
I
that
could
we would
say about that.
probably still be in the same category, right? I guess we were both in memoir, nonfiction, creative nonfiction, or something like. I don't know what the categories even
Yeah,
are
but the book
now.
that won was a photography book.
Right, right. We were up against Marriott, so also on my
Although
list.
she had three essays in her book, and I wrote one of them. So, but I didn't get credit for that. So,
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, it's the notion too of like, writing intros for other people, writing forwards for other people, writing chapters. I mean, Vern Bulla published, I think, my first essay in an anthology and called it The Wife, which was not my title, I will just say. Though I adored Vern, frankly.
he was
Um,
a sweetheart.
I
Yeah.
was I was thinking like at the time when he got sick, we were actually talking about me coming and doing a PhD in history with him as my
Mm.
mentor, and then he took ill and died not long after. So that was my moment of like, and then later I thought about doing one with Susan, but also didn't stay at Bloomington long enough. So, um, yeah, complications. But yeah, Vern was such an enthusiastic, sweet person. Another person I feel very lucky to have met and known and
Me
corresponded
too.
with.
And Mickey Diamond also, who died
Yes.
recently. Very
Did
sad.
oh,
Amazing, amazing person.
I did not know that. Oh,
Yeah, he passed just a few months ago.
shit. Okay. There are so many people, again, these shoulders of giants, and some of the people who I came to know. I mean, Richard Doctor, I don't know if he's still with us either. Um,
I is still. I think he is, although he's not. He's quite old.
yeah, he must be. I mean, that's one of the things. It's so weird, and one of the reasons this project, and I think I want Lynn's death. Also, I think Lynn would love the fact that she managed to kick me in the ass one more time. So that's absolutely true. But the notion of kind of going, oh, when you're 55, which is what I am, which I know that makes me a spring chicken to you, but you all of a sudden start to go, wait, all of the people older than me who welcomed me and showed me how to do this work and occasionally yelled at me or whatever, um, are 20 years older than me. Like I gotta get these interviews on the table. Because we have missed. I mean, God, I would wish I had a video interview with Les Feinberg. We met a couple of times, just a lovely, lovely human being. And Minnie's gone now too. So it's like,
Yeah, oh, that was so shocking. Yeah,
well, Minnie was the first partner for me, so that she had a book, which I've never known how to pronounce, S slash she, yeah.
yeah,
But I didn't know that existed, other than there was that one wife of a crossdresser who'd also written a book, Mary, Jane Ellen,
that's
Mary,
about
yeah.
that's a yeah, that not happily not very queer
No,
conscious there one.
no,
Yeah.
that was a universe that I know that when we walked into, we were like, "Oh, you guys are
What is
like
this?
straight." It's
Yeah.
not our scene.
It
Um,
was always odd in that context,
yeah,
but those people needed help.
yeah. Oh God, I know. Well, that's why everyone predicted that Virginia Prince and I wouldn't like each other because I had yelled about Trias in one of the books. But it was like, sorry, but there's a lot of really homophobic, transphobic shit coming out of your organization. So and actually, in that case too, when I started yelling about that, Dallas was the one who was like, "We got you, kid." Like we've
Yeah.
all made these complaints about that scene, like, and I think sent me one of her pieces that she'd written, which was very
Yes.
funny because Dallas, yeah, is always very funny.
Dallas is great.
Yeah. So yeah, and so I'm looking forward to as many other kinds of interviews. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to talk about? I feel like I don't want to keep you for forever, though. Again, you and I could talk for 4 hours probably without blinking. So,
Oh, we could. Um, I don't know. There's probably a million things that, I mean, like, how I learned to run groups was really being a manager in corporate America. I managed writers and artists in corporations. Nobody knows this. I mean, people don't realize I was a ski instructor, a photographer,
wow.
a musician. I played rock and roll and folk music back in the 60s, but rock and roll in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I did musical comedy theater. I've
Of
done,
course you did. That is the least surprising thing you have ever said to me. Okay.
that's because you saw me at Fantasia Fair probably do the performance thing
Yes.
and the at the yeah.
I know, but it's like musical theater people just have a certain, it's a je ne sais quoi. Rachel is not a musical theater actor, so, but we certainly know plenty of y'all, and yeah, it's
Yeah.
lovely.
And yeah, I mean, it's just I've done so many things in my life. It's just really, I'm really, really, I feel, I don't know, blessed is such a, you know, overused term, but I've just been really lucky in so many ways. And I've suffered in many ways. I've had lots of horrible things happen. Um, and yet I've survived, and I've still been able to continue mentoring young people. I'm doing work through um, the the Intentional Man Project, which is started by Rocco Chiatos, and that sponsors the Camp Lost Boys events that have been going on now for about 5 years, I guess, 5 6 years. And really amazing. It's growing like crazy, and we talk a lot about uh, you know, positive and constructive and non-traumatic masculinity. We talk a lot. We do a lot of intergenerational work and trying to build trans masculine community in a way that is helpful to people and can go beyond just being trans.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. I think we as trans people shouldn't be segregated, and we shouldn't have our own bathrooms. We should be able to go to any bathroom, and we and we should be able to be any part of society. We should be full human beings. Just because we're trans doesn't mean we're not full beings or incapable of making a contribution to society. So that's
And you know me, I don't understand why y'all aren't just running everything personally, but that's, you know, um, again, I have met so many absolutely remarkable people that when I do occasionally deal with transphobia, I'm like, you really like you can't you have to meet more trans people because that the transphobia will just go away in the context of all the artistic genius and organizing capacity and invention. And it's like you just sit back and take in the awesomeness. Still, it's still frustrating that you can meet people who are like, I just don't get it. I'm like, you don't have to get it. Just appreciate the brilliance of trans people, maybe for a hot
yeah,
second, and shush, you know. But
yeah, right, exactly. Well said.
more of that. Okay. So I guess final words. What's the piece of advice you would have given to your younger self?
Don't be so timid.
Were you really that timid? It's really kind of hard
I
to.
don't want to do, I don't want to take Dallas's thunder, but Dallas was asked that question once, and she said, "Brush your teeth."
Honestly. Dental
Very
shit
good
is
advice.
expensive. I know that the I
Very,
just heard someone refer to teeth as luxury bones, and I'm like, that's really what it feels like a lot of days.
yeah, yeah.
And anything, at least in terms of like getting older gracefully, because I feel like you are a marvelous example who's kind of held me back from being angry and bitter about things that I have no control over whatsoever. So,
Well, yeah. Pick your battles, right? Um, Growing up gracefully is about making sure that not only that you do the things that inspire you, that make you that you know are right to do, the things that motivate you, that are for other people, but also do things for yourself. Do the things that manifest you and give you pleasure. Um, and that's not just about sex. That's really about, self-expression. It's about caring for animals. It's about hiking in nature. It's about do those things that 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 make you feel alive and part of the world. That's where it's at. It's being part of the world and loving others, loving yourself, loving other people. That's what humanity does. We love. We communicate and we love. That's what sets us apart
yeah,
from other creatures, although many other creatures love, but it's just different from what we do. And there's the world is a big place. Don't get stuck. Don't get stuck.
yeah, keep moving
Take
forward.
good care of yourself. Brush your teeth. And don't be so timid
And yeah, yeah, take up space. That's I think, especially working with people in
without
the same.
trashing other people.
Yeah.
Without trashing other people.
Yep. Yes. Hold
Be
your own without
kind.
stepping on other people's toes all the time, but
Yep.
it can be tricky, but anyway. Um,
But that's how I learned to manage. I managed people. I managed creative people the way I would want to be managed. And that's how I developed FTMI also, and Female to Male International, FTM International, by trying to encourage people to go ahead, try something, make a mistake. It's okay. We're going to grow together. We're going to make this happen together. It's not about me.
Right.
It's about all of us.
Yeah. Yes, I can't imagine managing artists and musicians. So that's some cat herding. Um, and it's still such an amazing skill. I like meeting people who don't understand. Rachel and I have both certainly had people who are terrible at managing creatives in our lives, and it's such a terrible work experience. So the notion of sort of how do you, yeah, I think passing the baton, that's something that I'm thinking about a lot recently. Is sort of like how do you do more of that? I feel like it's built into to some degree because I teach, right, and so you're helping people on their way to getting degrees so that they go into the world, and it's sort of part of the process. But I think if I came from a different universe where this it wasn't part of my job, it might be harder to do that, if that makes any sense. The territoriality and the
Yeah, I think
how things
I've
are
been
done.
lucky in that respect. But yeah, without a platform ever, and no, I have a PhD in law, but no university post to speak from, no position of authority, but I've done pretty well, all things considered.
Yes, you are totally an authority, but okay. I mean, whatever. Don't get me started on the current state of the academy. So, but the idea of like degrees being the only thing that confers that. The reality is seeing you speak in documentaries, whatever degrees people do or don't have. It's very obviously again, I could interview you for another 4 hours easily just about the legal stuff, which is also endlessly fascinating. Um, if you're going to self-describe, like, what is your career? I know you're an author. I know you're an educator. Um, you just said you're not a professor, so there's that. Are there other things, like in terms of the public health? What is the most important aspect for you these days?
Writing.
Writing.
I'm a writer.
Yeah.
That's
Uh,
the bottom line. I'm a writer.
you don't shake it, do you? I keep hoping I'm going to shake the need to write, but it's never happened. So, not just because it's
Now I
exhausting
have
and
to
time
go.
consuming and sort of weird, lonely work, but
I know.
yeah. And what?
But now I do have to go.
Okay, yes. And please go write. I'm looking forward to reading your novels at some point. So good luck with that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Good night. Or good afternoon, I guess we're at now.
Yes. Good
Thanks.
afternoon. We're both in the same hemisphere of time.
Exactly. Thank you so much, James. Be well, of
Thank you, Helen. I really appreciate it.
course.
Thank, good luck with the series. Love
Thank
it.
you.
Love it.
Bye.
Bye.